Vincent van Gogh. Even if you know nothing about art, you know that name. If you could only name 5 paintings, one of them would probably be Starry Night. However, Van Gogh was not that famous when he was alive. In fact, he only ever sold 1 painting in his lifetime, The Red Vineyard. If he wasn't successful in his life, then how is he famous now? We have one person to thank for most of that. One woman. Her name was Jo van Gogh Bonger. But how did her life change art history? Let's take a look. She was born October 4th, 1862 in Amsterdam. Her full name was Johanna Gesine Bonger, named after her mother's sister. She was her parents' 5th child and was baptized on November 2nd. She suffered from the common childhood illnesses of the time, chickenpox, whooping cough, and measles. Her parents were Hermina Louisa Weissman and Hendrik Christian Bonger Jr. Later in life, she described her father like this, quote, "My dear father is what they call very liberal, but a truly pious, religious man, who does not pay lip service to the divine doctrine, love thy neighbor as thyself, but acts upon it," end quote. She described her mother as someone who, quote, "relies solely on her feeling, which is exceptionally well developed, so she could trust it implicitly, because her instincts are always right, but she wouldn't have been like that if she'd been on her own," end quote. She had a relatively carefree childhood. Her family was middle class, she played piano and loved cats and dogs. She was especially close with 3 of her siblings, Hermina Louisa, Andries, and Elizabeth Hortense. She described her childhood self like this, quote, "As a child, I was quiet and withdrawn and devoured every book I could, the good with the bad. It never did me any harm. On the contrary, it developed my mind, but physically I remained a child for a long time. When I was 18, I looked 14 and sadly lacked experience. I had never been out in the world and seldom among strangers, was desperately shy and awkward," end quote. When she grew up, she got 3 teaching certificates between the years 1880 and 1883 and taught at a variety of schools. Her brother, Andries, introduced her to his friend, Theo van Gogh, the brother of Vincent van Gogh. Theo was immediately smitten with her. He wrote to his sister, quote, "As you know, I've only seen her a couple times, but what I know of her really attracts me. She gave me the impression that I could place my trust in her in a complete, indefinable way, as I could in no one else. I would be able to talk to her about everything, and I believed, if she wanted, she could be oh so much to me. Now it's just the question as to whether she thinks the same," end quote. Unfortunately for him, she was in love with a man named Johann Edward Stumpf. On July 22nd, 1887, Theo proposed to Jo seemingly out of nowhere. As she was still in love with someone else, she said no. However, she couldn't seem to get the proposal out of her head, writing in her diary, quote, "It would sound improbable in a novel, yet it really happened. After being in my company for 3 days at most, he wants to spend his whole life with me. What he conjured up for me was what I've always dreamed of, a life full of variety, full of food for the mind, a circle of people around us who wish us well, who want to do something in the world," end quote. Eventually, her feelings for Stumpf began to change. She noticed that he didn't give as much of himself as she gave to him, and he didn't feel the same she felt about him. 3 months after her 26th birthday, she accepted Theo's proposal. Theo confided in her his fears about his brother, telling her, quote, "The prospect of losing my brother, who has meant so much to me and has become so much a part of me, made me realize what a terrible emptiness I would feel if he were no longer there," end quote. Whenever he felt distressed over this, he would think of Jo to make himself feel better. Their engagement reception was held on January 9th, 1889. She regretted that she had not accepted his proposal at first, as she was very happy. They got married on April 12th, 1889. She found out she was pregnant 10 weeks after their wedding night. They decided to name the baby Vincent after the baby's uncle and asked Big Vincent to be Little Vincent's godfather. He happily agreed. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on January 31st, 1890. Big Vincent painted the almond blossoms for his newly born nephew and godson. It was time for Jo to meet her brother-in-law in person. She was very nervous. She was surprised to see that he was very healthy looking, writing in her journal, quote, "Before me was a sturdy, broad-shouldered man with a healthy color, a cheerful look in his eyes, and something very resolute in his appearance." She continued, quote, "He looks much stronger than Theo, was my first thought," end quote. When they introduced him to the baby, Jo watched as both brothers had tears in their eyes. However, the happiness did not last long. They received news that the elder Vincent had shot himself. Theo immediately left to be by his side. He wrote to Jo that Vincent, quote, "was lonely, and sometimes it was more than he could bear," end quote. Vincent died at 1:30 p.m. on July 29, 1890. Jo wrote to Theo, quote, "I would do anything if only I could make up for his loss. Love you far, far more even, if that were possible, end quote. Early October 1890, Theo's mental and physical health had significantly deteriorated. Many thought it was due to Vincent's death. It is now believed that Theo may have had syphilis, although he did not pass it on to Joe. He was acting erratic and manic. Theo had 2 epileptic fits and never regained consciousness after them. She saw him for the last time on January 25, 1891. He died later that night at the age of 33. After his death, she moved to Bussum and opened a boarding house called Villa Helma. This was a very common thing for widows to do at the time and was considered a respectable job for women to have. It opened on May 1, 1891 and housed 3 guests at a time. Theo did not have a will. Since he owned Vincent's work, half of it went to Joe and the other half went to their son. However, he was underage, so she was in control of his portion until he turned 21. She wrote in her diary for the first time in 3 years on May 8, 1897, quote, Theo taught me a lot about art. No, let me say rather that he taught me a lot about life. I learned everything through him. The greatest bliss, the greatest suffering, that teaches us to understand everything else. As well as the child, he has left me with another task, Vincent's work, getting it seen and appreciated as much as possible, keeping all the treasures that Theo and Vincent had collected intact for the child. That, too, is my work, end quote. And so she began the next chapter of her life. She was very strategic when she sold his work and donated it to exhibitions. She didn't send too many at a time, although the response was still not very positive. She visited Theo's grave on the anniversary of his death. She brought him roses like he had given to her after their wedding day. She wrote, quote, I'd want to stay and lie there beside him in the cold earth. I am so tired of all the worrying and thinking about everything, and the future weighs down on me so, end quote. She had begun reading and sorting through the letters that the brothers had written to each other, but had some trouble because Vincent didn't date them. Joe had a friend from childhood, Anna Dirks, who married the painter Jan Veth. Joe was determined to get him to appreciate Vincent's work. He very strongly disliked the work at first. Joe sent him some of the brothers' letters, quote, I read the letters, not only with my head, I was deep into them with my whole soul, she wrote to Veth. Quote, I read them and reread them until the whole figure of Vincent was clear before me, end quote. She told him that she wished she could, quote, make you feel the influence that Vincent has had on my life. I found serenity, end quote. Eventually, Beth came around saying, quote, once having grasped his beauty, I can accept the whole man, end quote. Joe is at a soiree at Hotel Continental in Paris in September 1889 when she met a man named Isaac Israels. He was 24 and she was 27. He came from a wealthy Jewish family but was not practicing. By 1894, they were contacting each other frequently. In January 1895, she wrote in her diary, quote, I only felt safe and comfortable in the studio with Israels. They were wonderful afternoons. Lazy, I believe. He drew a little portrait of me, crayon. I just sat very still, resting easily, and he talked, brought back to me all sorts of things from the past. It was very pleasant, very good, our feelings then, end quote. Eventually, she tried to put an end to things. Quote, I've put an end to the ambiguous nature of our relationship. I don't want to play with fire any longer, end quote. She felt hurt by how quickly Isaac agreed. They didn't stop spending time together, however, and Joe's feelings for him didn't change. She wanted marriage, and he told her, quote, as I've told you many times before, I can't even think about something more permanent, end quote. After several disagreements, they eventually grew apart. After Isaac, there was Johann Cohen Hoshach. She met him through Anna and Jan in the late 1890s. He later stayed at her boarding house in the summer of 1900. They got engaged on her birthday in the same year. However, it was a while before they got married, as both of them were constantly questioning and unsure of their relationship. Eventually, they tied the knot on August 21, 1901. She changed her last name to Cohen Joshach Banger. She closed her boarding house to focus on domestic duties. However, the marriage was not a happy one. Joe often found herself disappointed, and Johann had a lot of physical and mental health issues. He would disappear for days at a time and got pleurisy many times over the course of their marriage. Her father died on April 28, 1904. Johann made a painting of him as a tribute. Her mother died a year later on June 18, 1905. Van Gogh's work was starting to decay, but Joe refused to have them varnished or restored as she feared they would be unintentionally harmed. She was offered very large sums of money multiple times to sell the entirety of her collection, but every time she refused. Mid-1910, she started working on translating and publishing the brothers' letters in Dutch and German. Her son finally turned 21 on January 31st, 1911, and inherited his half of his uncle's work. Johann died of pleurisy on May 18, 1912, at the age of 38. Jo cared very much about helping oppressed people. Her dedication started when she went to a coal mine and was appalled by the working conditions. She was part of the socialist movement. She fought for women's suffrage, and though she didn't consider herself one at the time, by modern standards, she was a feminist. She became very close with another member of the party, Matilda Vibot-Berdenis, whose daughter, Josina, got engaged to her son Vincent. In December 1913, she changed her name back to Van Gogh Bonger for multiple reasons. Firstly, so she would have the same last name as her son. Secondly, it would look better if the published letters had the same last name as the brothers on them. Thirdly, she valued her 2 years with Theo more than her 10 with Johann. She reburied Theo so he was next to his brother on April 14, 1914. When she published their letters, she cut out many things, including quoted religious texts, illnesses, talk of sex, arguments, and referred to people still living by only their initials. Her son wrote, quote, "When Vincent's letters were first published, we got quite a lot of comments from family members who were shocked that all sorts of personal things were made public," end quote. Once the letters were published in German, a newspaper wrote, quote, "The work is done and Van Gogh enters history. The artist has become kind of a classic," end quote. Vincent and Josina got married on January 14, 1915. They then moved to New York the same year on October 17th, where Josina was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had one of her breasts removed and survived. While there, the couple lent some Van Goghs to American exhibitions. Jo moved to America and stayed with them for a couple of years. While there, she donated the 3 volumes of the letters to the New York Library. While Jo enjoyed her stay, her son did not, writing, quote, "In some respects, she made things very difficult for us. She could have tried to fit in with us a bit more," end quote. She had trouble selling his work and told someone, quote, "I saw there the most modern French pictures, and I supposed the American taste in art was advanced enough fully to appreciate Van Gogh, in which I have been rather mistaken," end quote. So, to compensate, she lowered the prices. When some of his work was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the critics did not like it. In response, Jo wrote, quote, "It is the fate of critics to be remembered by what they failed to understand," end quote. Her first grandson, named Theo after his grandfather, was born on November 5th, 1920. She said that, quote, "He's an indescribable angel with the loveliest nature in the world, really sweet-tempered," end quote. Her second grandson was named after his step-grandfather, Johann, and was born on March 26, 1922. Back in 1918, she started having painful cramps in her hand, the early signs of Parkinson's disease. Later, she began treatment, quote, "I had an electric treatment and was absolutely forbidden to write, and having neither a typewriter nor a secretary here in the country, I couldn't be more disabled," end quote. She felt that her life would soon be over and said, quote, "It is so good, after so many years of public indifference, even hostility towards Vincent and his work, to feel towards the end of my life, the battle is won," end quote. She died in her sleep on Wednesday, September 22, 1925, at the age of 62. She was buried on September 6th next to her second husband. An obituary written by Wilhelm Steinhoff said, quote, "She heroically completed her mission, and in doing so intellectually enriched her own life," end quote. He continued that, quote, "She was helping people understand the value of Vincent van Gogh as a person and an artist," end quote. After she died, all of Van Gogh's work was passed on to her son. Her grandson, Johann, wrote, "At the time, my father definitely wanted to keep his Van Gogh collection intact, but not to devote any further effort to it. He was concentrating on his engineering career and did not want to be regarded as the nephew of the famous painter. It was not until after the war that he took an active interest in the collection," end quote. In 1927, her son had the letters published in English. In 1962, a Japanese magazine, Art Garden, published an article about Vincent van Gogh. It talked about Jo, saying, quote, "The wise Madame Bonger, Joanna, is a miraculous paragon among women. One hopes that the women of the world will follow Madame Bonger's example, and, not merely content to be mothers, will bear the desire to discover and cultivate genius," end quote. If Jo had never accepted Theo's proposal, Vincent van Gogh would likely have been a name lost to history. But thanks to her work and dedication, he is now a household name. I hope that one day hers will be as well.
I know there's more to learn. I know there's more to be. As all the rays of the sun shine beyond the sea. Every moment with the intent wind enlighten